Hello there. Today we're talking about Chapter 10, Diversity in Psychology. And so today what we'll do is talk a little bit about Chapter 10 in kind of a lecture format, and then I'm going to give you a class activity. So if you can imagine you're doing this in class, you can do the activity on your own easily. If you want to, you don't have to do this, but if you want to, and you can reach out to someone, you know someone in class, feel free to reach out and do it together. That's fine also. So here is the lecture, and then I'll explain the activity. I think you'll find it kind of fun. All right, so the first thing to really think about in terms of diversity is this idea that what we're really talking about is psychology and diversity. And so thinking back to the beginnings of Western psychology or psychological science as we understand it, it's very much a product of Europe, and then when transferred to America, a product of America. And so what we're looking at is, what do you know actually about psychology in other countries and the psychological roots of other countries? In other words, Western psychology, we talked about roots of how you explain a sense of self. We talked about a sense of interiority. We talked about a model of health, a model of illness, how we explain this in our Western world. But other countries that are not in the Western world have different models of health and illness and healing. So what we're going to do today is help you explore a little bit in this area. All right. One of the things the text talks about is the concept of indigenation. And so I thought I would help you understand that. Indigenation is the act of making something more native. And so this is something that is an idea that is foreign, that comes to a place and becomes native. So you could think of psychology as being indigenized to the United States. Psychology came from Germany, from Europe, and people went to Germany to be trained. They came over, they started doing the same kinds of things here in the United States, but then the United States sort of took over how we talked about pragmatism being an American value. We talked about physiognomy, we talked about phrenology, we talked about a number of things that were ways that America made psychology uniquely her own. And so this is what indigenization means. It means making it uniquely your own. And so now the psychology we practice is American psychology. It's not German psychology at all. And it's very much modified. And in fact, America became such a center for psychology that is, and if you think about last chapter, this is in large part because there was so much support, financial support primarily, but a ton of support for the practice of psychology in America, that the American style of psychology became just psychology. And so when we think about psychology, we're thinking about really American psychology. That is, it's become American psychology, and we're kind of exporting it to the world. And so indigenization would be how another culture takes in that psychology and makes it their own. And so the act of making something more native, transforming it to be in alignment with a local culture. Okay, so that is what indigenization means. Cultures have different worldviews, right? Your beliefs about reality, it affects how you think, how you perceive what's going on, how you attribute causality, how you behave, how you think you can know things, your epistemology. It affects your conception of what the world is, what everything means. What does the future look like? What does the past look like? What is religion? What do you value? Those sorts of things. Axiology, that's your word for the day. Values. So one thing like a thought question to start off with is thinking about, what is the worldview at SVU in general? If you think of SVU as sort of a mini culture, what is the SVU worldview? How much does it differ from your worldview? How much does it match your worldview? And so I would love for you to think about that and take a look at the discussion board and use that. Okay, that is not clear. Sorry. Blah, 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 blah. You think about your view of the world and the SVU view of the world, and how do they differ? How are they the same? Put that up on the discussion board so we can kind of have a discussion about that. All right. So, like we said, psychology as a science really began in Germany, England, and the United States and France. This is where some of the primary beginnings of psychology happened. But the practice of psychology, if you think of healing, mental health healing as the practice of psychology, not as the science where we had Wilhelm Wundt and we had William James and we had B.F. Skinner, etc. If we think about the practice of mental health healing, that's and including any kind of treatment from a traditional culture, that's much larger than our idea of the practice of psychology. And so it's kind of it's actually very, very interesting to look at how other cultures see treatment for mental health disorders without even using the word psychology. Sometimes if you use the word psychology in your search for this, then you get results that are very much geared toward psychology and not so much geared toward what you're looking for. If you're looking for how did people conceive sickness and health and mental disorders or hallucinations or psychoticism or bad behavior, etc. So you've got all kinds of theories of health, wellness, causality in various cultures. Shamans, healers, etc. So there's a really interesting book you may want to take a look at some point called Persuasion and Healing by a guy named Jerome Frank. And this book contains a lot of explanations for other cultures' ideas about how healing works. And so Frank's point in the book is that there are healings that happen in these contexts. And so it's not as if they're just practicing nothing. He talks about how shamans have a very healing influence and they can go in and make an intervention that works. So he gives a lot of very, very interesting examples of how people experience change outside of our context of traditional psychology, but in a context of their own explanations about how the world works, their own worldview. And so one of the problems that we run into, philosophically, is that most psychologies, right? We talked about multiple psychologies in the beginning of this course. Most psychologies, and if you consider theories of healing or worldviews in other cultures to be a kind of psychology, most of them claim that they can explain everything about a human. They're universal in nature. So that's kind of interesting because cultural difference would indicate that they're not universal, although they all believe that they are universal. If you had somebody come in and say, I'm going to heal you with a traditional shamanistic practice, you may not be healed because you entirely don't believe in that. So that's leads to that whole aspect of what creates the basis for healing in psychology. Another very interesting thought for your discussion board. Okay. Looking at American psychology, typical kind of cultural egocentrism, like most things, before we really kind of woke up to this idea that cultural differences are a thing, and they're not just Americans versus barbarians, right? That's really a straw man. That's really a poor argument. But there's some extent to which people just blindly assumed that if they just translate into their language, then those concepts will be, considered the same basic idea. It's just a matter of translation, instead of realizing that it's not a matter of just translation. It's entirely conceptual understanding. So what people would do, and still sometimes do, is just take a measure like say the STAI, the State Trait Anxiety Inventory by Spielberger. We'll say, okay, well, we need to find out what the anxiety is in a country of, I don't know, something. China, right? So let's take it to China. We'll just translate it into Chinese. And the assumption is that if we just translate the measure into Chinese, then it will tap into anxiety, just like it taps into the same kind of anxiety here in America. So you can see obvious, like to us right now, it's obvious that that is pretty egocentric or cultural centric. And when people would do that, it was like people were blind to this for the most part. Then people started realizing, oh, some cultures experience anxiety in a really different way. They have different symptoms, different explanations, etc. So we are taking a hard look across the board in many ways about how we export our system of health to other cultures, and our belief that our medical system works better than anyone else's, our mental health system works better than anyone else's, or works at all and other systems don't work, or if they do work, it's just a matter of the placebo effect, right? We see this a lot with like a traditional Chinese medicine. We'll think, oh, well, obviously that can't work because it's not American. So how could that work? It doesn't work. These people are just silly. 5,000 years of them being silly. It's all the placebo effect for 5,000 years, right? Which is an unbelievably ignorant point of view. And it's something that requires a lot of thought. Other cultures they observe what works. They observe what creates healing, and they make their health systems out of things that have worked. It's not like they're not scientific. If you think about the scientific method being founded on empiricism is observing, making observations. And so other cultures make observations of what seems to help, and then they use those things that seem to help. And traditional Chinese medicine is a great example of 5,000 years of careful observation and writing down what happens, that has created a much more sophisticated medical view than we often give it credit for in our westernized points of view. Okay, here's an example. We talked just about China and traditional Chinese medicine, but if we look at China and their psychology, a lot of the psychology is imported from America. Before psychology, remember in Europe, we talked about what happened before psychology. Well, it was religion. And it's that way throughout the world. It's just, often a different religion, a different cultural worldview, a different view of what religion means. So much of China's psychology was imported from America as psychology. Their view of health was more religious, but psychology has begun to replace that in China. There's a long period of no psychology, no intellectual, really anything. All the intellectuals were sent away during the Cultural Revolution in China. And then starting around the 80s or so, psychology became more developed. What we're talking about as American psychology became much more developed in China. And it's still pretty American. It has not been really taken over and taken into the culture and become something that is inherently Chinese. It's still fairly American. Another example is Haiti. Haiti has a long history of integrating the primary religions of the slaves that had been brought to Haiti. Haiti was operated by the French for a long, long time. I think since early 1600s, Spain Spain lost Haiti to the French, and lots and lots of slavery happened. And so slaves had integrated some of the primary ideas from their religions of origin, and this integration resulted in the voodoo religion. Plays a large role still in the country, very large role. It's a recognized religion in the country. So when people get sick, they still use primarily faith-based healing, especially for mental health problems in Haiti. And they can use voodoo in addition to their Catholic and Protestant faith. There's a easy back and forth between the two. They don't see this as a conflict of anything. It's like you go to your priest and you go to the voodoo healer. It takes a long time to become a voodoo healer. You have to, I think it takes 5 years to become a healer in voodoo. Another, more about Haiti, okay? The Western idea is that you are in charge of your world. Like, you have the impact. You're the one who creates your world. The voodoo view of how this works is that the larger context you live in, the spiritual and psychosocial context that you live in, is what is in charge of the world. And so the idea of, I need to do X, Y, Z to fix this, is really different. And so if you can imagine trying to work with someone who doesn't see them as having much influence on what happens to them or on their symptoms, you can see how that would be pretty different from a lot of Western ideas that focus on, you can make a difference. Here are some things you can do to change, some things you can do to heal your symptoms. And so the voodoo view is that spirits are what interact with and guide the living in a really kind of dramatic, large way. Everyone has a little good angel, a T-bone man, responsible for their consciousness, responsible for their emotion. And so you can see if it's this little good angel that's in charge of your emotion, how could it be that you're doing things that create that? You know, and so we tend to look at this and say, oh yeah, well, obviously that's just their primitive understanding. We might think that. But what if they just looked at us and thought, their primitive understanding, who's right and who's wrong, right? So in addition to like the little good angel, we tend to think being possessed is something very negative, whereas in this culture, spiritual possession is not necessarily negative. It could be very, very positive. It could be actually a method of healing, a spiritual possession as a method of healing, using the spirits. They see depression as being not really typical Western idea. It's more like if you're depressed, it's connected to physiological problems, largely malnutrition. And interestingly, we have a ton of data that supports that depression is indeed actually connected to nutrients in many ways. Certainly, we know now that depression is more about inflammation. It's a disease of inflammation. And so nutrients can truly impact inflammation levels. So interesting there that we're moving in a similar direction. Mental health problems in Haiti are generally minimized. If you want to apply Western style therapy to a Haitian, they will minimize their mental health problems. Of course, they're explained differently, very, very differently, which makes it hard to use traditional therapy that focuses on individual accountability, responsibility for creating change. A lot of times, mental health problems are actually spiritual forces. They're spiritual forces that are caused by envious others. And so there's no sense of, this is me. It's like, well, someone else was very jealous of me, and so they have created this problem for me with their spiritual forces. Possession, bad luck, and spiritual retaliation are considered the causes of most mental health problems. Possession, bad luck, spiritual retaliation. And so the treatment for this is often, not always, often some form of cleansing. cleansing the self, cleansing the home, the environment, something along those lines. Okay, so this is actually as far as I would have gone in class for a lecture today. And what we would do for the rest of the class, and what I would like you to do on your own, is spend the rest of the time for today's lecture researching psychology in any country of your interest, any culture of your interest. Post about this in the discussion. Okay, so what I want to see is some good reporting on that area. When did that area's psychology start, and how does it have traditional American psychology has it been indigenized yet or not? What is the traditional method of healing for mental health? How do you describe their model of health? How do you describe their model of illness? What does treatment look like? So I described a little bit of Haiti for you. So at least that much information and depth in your discussions for today. Remember, when you're looking for this, when you're searching on Google or wherever, I found a lot of information actually in PubMed. Take care to think about your search terms, because like I said, if you use the word psychology, you may leave out some important articles on what does wellness look like, what is illness, what does mental health look like. So kind of think about that. So if you want, find a partner. If you don't, and you want to do it on your own, perfectly fine too. In any case, grab on to some culture you choose and use the bulk of the rest of today's lecture time to dive into experience, I guess, learn about, not so much experience, but really get a sense of what things are like in that different culture, broaden your understanding, and then share with us. Okay, great. And then I'll see you Thursday for our Slater discussion. Take care.